thank you for this presentation. I am honored to be with you today, and I'm even more honored to introduce Professor Nonna Mayer. As a PhD scholar, I attended some seminars, some lectures she held in Paris, and I was always very impressed. So Professor Nonna Mayer is Research Director Emerita at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics at Sciences Po. She has been the chair of the French Political Science Association between 2005 and 2016. And she has been since 2016 a member of the National Consultative Commission for Human Rights. She's a co-PI of the annual Racism Barometer. She has published intensively on topics connected with radical right populism, but among her most important analyses, I thought it was important to say that she was one of the coordinators of the French research group that inquired into depth the national front, and both in terms of demand and supply side. Among her most recent publication, I would like to mention the impact on gender on votes for the populist radical rights, with a focus on Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour, published in Modern and Contemporary France in 2022. She published Political Science Approaches to the Far Right, which is a chapter in a very well-known edited book by Ash, Busher, Macklin, and Winter, entitled Researching the Far Right, published with Routledge in 2020. And she has covered the topic of the radical right in France in the one of the most important handbooks on the radical right, published coordinated by Ridgen in 2018. And among other publications, she published also the political impact of social security in France. Today, her lecture is entitled Cultural Explanation of Radical Right Populism and Beyond. And probably most of you know that populism has been explained, has been connected to different forms of determinants. And among the different determinants, there is a lot of emphasis on the cultural dimension. And this was particularly the case, for example, in one of the famous books published a couple of years ago by Pippa Norris and Engelhardt. However, from the abstract that I have seen, her presentation is a little bit more complex and goes beyond the cultural dimension, and she will provide a very timely topic dealing with Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour. Professor Mayer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very flattering. I'll try to be up to the standards, and I'll try to first share the screen successfully. Is that okay? Do you see? Do you see correctly, or do you want me to?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So I just wanted to do a better screen. Yes, cultural explanation of right-wing populism and beyond. So first, I'd start by redefining the topic a little bit, because I was supposed to talk about the cultural crisis and populism, and I'm a bit uneasy with the concept of crisis, because it's very much overused, often loosely defined. By definition, a crisis is temporary, it's a turning point, it's exceptional. There's a very good book about that by Michel Daubry, in French, not in English, but I think it has been translated in English. So I will change the topic to cultural explanations of right-wing populism and beyond, and in a more long-term perspective. And I'll use a lot the book by Pippa Norris and Ronald Engelhardt about the cultural backlash theory. And I'll try to nuance it a little to show it's a little more complicated. So today, the two main explanations of right-wing populism are economic and cultural. Economic, it's the idea that what made the trick, it's globalization, that they appeal, these parties, to the losers of globalization. And more recently, the cultural explanations have become predominant, and the book of Engelhardt and Norris has had so many reads. What I'd like to show you is that both matter, economic insecurity and cultural insecurity. And among cultural issues, some matter more than others, mainly immigration. And I'll test it on the French case, taking it as a magnifying glass with Marine Le Pen and Zemmour, two candidates of the radical right populism in 2022. So first I'll go back to some key concepts, but you probably know by heart by now. Then I'll show one, the theories, globalization losers versus cultural backlash. Two, what Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour stand for. They both see immigration as a threat to French identity, but they diverge completely on moral, especially gender issues. And I'll see in the third part what drives their voters. And then there'll be a conclusion. So as an introduction, what definition will I take of populism, right-wing populism, and French right-wing populism? You know the definition by Mude and Kaltwasser. There are many ways to define populism. They propose to define populism by its ideas, via ideology, ideas, and world vision. And they show that it's a thin-centered ideology, minimalist. It can be hosted by many thicker, more consistent ideologies of the left, the right, and the center. But whatever the populism, there are three core concepts. One, the idea that there's the clash between the antagonism between the pure people versus the corrupt elite. So that means the second dimension, not only is there an antagonism, but it's a moral fight, the pure people. And last, politics should be an expression of the volonté générale. Populism mask themselves behind the mask of democracy based on general will, but they say they are the ones who really represent the people. But I'll be talking not of populism in general, but of radical right populism. And there again, I'm sure you've read Cas Mude, Populist Radical Right Parties in Europe, or his more recent book on the far right today. And it's populism, of course, and it's authoritarianism, but it's nativism. And there we are at the heart of the culturalist explanation. These parties, from Marine Le Pen to Trump to so many others all over the world now, they are xenophobic and nationalist. They favor the natives versus the non-natives. It's an exclusionist vision of the people. So first, the theories. If you take the globalization losers theory, it's the idea that with the acceleration of globalization and at the turn of the 1990s, there has been increasing competition, but it's not only economic opening of borders, it's cultural because of the migrations, and it's political. New transnational actors limiting state sovereignty, such as the European Union. And the idea is, look at the book of Kriesi and his colleagues, it creates winners, skilled, cosmopolitan, internationalized workers and their employers, and losers who are or who feel threatened. And it's a new transnational cleavage taken over by these parties who say they are the only ones who defend the losers of globalization. They say they are going to go back to what it was before, close borders, protect them against globalization and against immigrants. And they frame, and there again, we are out of the cultural frame, they frame it as a triple threat. Economic, immigrants will take your job. Cultural, they are threatening our identity. And political, the nation state is no more sovereign. So there we have something which many call a new transnational cleavage cutting through the left-right divide. Now, what about the other theory, the silent revolution, the cultural backlash? We must go back to the silent revolution, Engelhardt wrote in 1977, analyzing the rise of post-materialist values in the specific context after World War II, peace, prosperity, fueled by generational turnover and increased level of education and urbanization. And these values are individualistic, permissive, hedonist, cosmopolitan. They were at the heart of all the social movement, like May 68 in France, that promoted the rights of women, gays, minorities, what one calls cultural liberalism. Their argument is that the very success of this cultural liberalism creates a backlash, a reaction among those who feel they are a minority. They say there are tipping moments when the people who are against that evolution turn against it, and it's for them, especially the older generation. And for them, it's the motor of the success of authoritarian populism. Other authors said that before, but much longer before. So now I'm going to take you into the French case in the last presidential election, where you had Le Pen versus Zemmour. And it's a very nice case to understand the impact of cultural factors. So you probably all know a little about the French Front National, today rebaptized Rassemblement National, National Gathering. It was co-founded a long time ago, not by Jean-Marie Le Pen alone, actually by Ordre Nouveau, a neo-fascist nationalist group with many students. They wanted to reunify the far right on the model of the Italian MSI. It was at the time of the Cold War. They were fiercely anti-communist and anti-leftist. The party only started to have electoral success in the 90s, 1983, 84. And then it became one of the most successful radical rights in Europe. But since Marine Le Pen took over, the daughter of Le Pen, and launched her strategy of mainstreaming, de-diabolization, it has progressed far more. And the main enemy today is no more communism, but immigrants and Islam, presented as a threat for civilization. Just a quick look. All these bars show you the presidential, parliamentary, regional, European, and local elections. Since Marine Le Pen took over, the success is obvious. Just look on the first chart, the first bars. In 2022, Marine Le Pen in the second round got more than 13 million voters and more than 41% of the votes, more than her father ever had, more than the extreme right ever had. So with Marine Le Pen's strategy of de-demonization, we are at the heart of a cultural strategy. She's tried to soften the extremist look of the party. She has banned anti-Semitism. She even presents her party as a rampart against Islamic fundamentalism, but often the shortcut is against Muslims. And also she is deliberately targeting women's vote since 2012. And she presents herself as a quasi-feminist. So there again, we are not at all in line with the traditional backlash described by Engelhardt and Pipanoris. Even more, she does pinkwashing and gendering of the immigration issues, which are the heart of her program. She presents immigrants as a danger for women in the public space, potential sexual aggressors, and Islam as the main threat today for women and gays. And that goes back to the analysis of femo-nationalism and homo-nationalism. It's not because you are gay or because you're a woman that you necessarily are progressive. You can't go behind Marine Le Pen. She presents herself as a protector. And she even presents herself as a rampart of democracy against the basic principles of the French Republic. Just to give you an idea, women are at the heart of her campaigns. A woman of heart in a world of men, a woman with convictions, the future state woman. In her letter to a French woman, she focuses on domestic violence, gynecological deserts, the help for single-parent families, and of course, to be harsher on street harassment, which of course is the fault of foreigners. And there was a survey just before the election, the presidential election, asking in the second round of the presidential election, which of the two candidates was the more feminist, an IFOP survey. And guess who was seen as more feminist? 49% of the sample of women, national sample, 49% considered Marine Le Pen was a feminist, 30% Macron. So it's a winning strategy somewhere, and it's definitely not on the line of moral conservatism. It's anti-immigrant, yes, but she says she is defending women. Now, her challenger is Eric Zemmour. It's a Jewish family from Algeria. He is journalist, writer. France has not said her last word, was his last book. He is a vedette on far-right channels like CNews. He's not part of the political class. His party and youth movement he created after being candidate. He did a flash ascent in the opinion polls before the election, even for a while surpassing Marine Le Pen and seen as a possible challenger of Macron. He fits all the dots. He is populist, he is authoritarian, and he is nativist. On that level, he is like, even worse, probably, than Marine Le Pen. Now, just to show you how he is on women, very different from Marine Le Pen. And it's important in the culture war. I put it in French to keep what it means, but I'll translate. Women has a form of intelligence different from those of men. Sorry to say so. And great geniuses are not men. I know one shouldn't say that. It's not femininely correct, but it's the truth. The real problem of society is to stir masculine desire. When a woman is in office, there's a kind of gap. She never assumes completely power, or she assumes it too much. Women are the root of all gifted man who wants to climb in society. And the top, people who are stagiaires, I don't remember how you say that in English, the people who help for nothing for a while when they start in an enterprise. It's done to blow job and making the coffee. So he is openly, brutally, vulgarly anti-feminist. Now, what ideas do they have in common? Populism, the vibrant claim of representing the French people and defending it against the mainstream parties. They have together a nativist, authoritarian vision of society, focused on the threat of immigrants and wanting to reduce all the rights of immigrants, all that is in the national, international conventions, limit the right of asylum, stop family reunion, reduce social benefits for foreigners, suppress jus soli. And specifically, they're against Islam as the main threat to French culture and values. But what makes them different? Zemmour goes even further. He believes in the conspirationist theory of the great replacement and the remigration theories. He wants to send all the immigrants back where they left from. He is ultra-assimilationist. Parents should give their children French names taken from the calendar, from the saints. Families should bury their dead in France. Veils should be forbidden in the public space. He is close to anti-Semitism. We can go back to it later. And culturally, as shown by the quotations, he is ultra-conservative, anti-feminist, sexist, anti-abortion, and he is more authoritarian than Marine Le Pen, also on the way, openly pro-Russian, which she was careful to say differently. Now, who votes and why? Cultural factors, economic factors, both. So one thing important, Marine Le Pen had a far better score than Eric Zemmour. She had 23% of the votes, he had 7% of the votes. And in the second round, he wasn't. First thing. Now I'll take the data from one of our post-electoral surveys, and it allows us to explore the motivations and profile of Le Pen-Zemmour in the last presidential election. I did a series of logistic regression to isolate the impact of each variable. And I used attitudes, again, pro-anti-Europe, ethnocentrism, sexism, social justice, feeling of insecurity, position on the left-right scale, and socio-demographic variables, gender, age, education, income, residence, religion, affiliation, and practice. So what does the data tell us? That the most predictive attitude and the most predictive variable of all is ethnocentrism, a scale with questions about immigrants, foreigners, Jews, Islam. The higher your level of ethnocentrism, the higher the probability you've voted for Marine Le Pen. Just at the same level, anti-EU feeling because EU is the open door to immigration, and not being left-wing. The more you're on the right, the more you vote for her. Now, what are the most predictive socio-demographics? Education, that goes with cultural issues. It's people with the lower level or a small vocational degree who vote for her. And age, and it's the contrary to the theory of Ingelhardt and Norris. It's the younger people who vote for Marine Le Pen, especially young people with little education, below 34. But economic insecurity comes just after, living conditions seen as deteriorating, and religion, It's the non-practicing Catholics that vote for Marine Le Pen. And we'll maybe come back to that in the discussion. It's very clear that gender has absolutely no impact in the last 3 presidential elections. Once you control with all these variables, women and men have supported Marine Le Pen in exactly the same dimension. And we also had questions about sexism, the good old sexism, depriving women of their elementary rights, and the modern sexism on the style, I'm not at all anti-feminist, I defend their rights, but really feminism today is going a little too further. Well, these sexism indicators have no impact on the vote for Marine Le Pen. Now, Zemmour. So there it's more difficult because it's a very small numbers. So we worked on the probabilities to vote for his party. There were more people. As Marine Le Pen, ethnocentrism and anti-European feelings and right-wing positions, ethnocentrism first, are the key variables. There's practically no effect of perceived economic insecurity. There is no impact of age. There's an opposite effect of education, the least educated. Those who vote the less for him. And there's an opposite effect of religion. He is more supported by practicing Catholics. And there's a strong negative impact of gender and sexism. Zemmour gets a male vote, anti-feminist, sexist, and morally conservative. And if there is a form of cultural backlash, he is the one who embodies that. But he has been far less successful than Marine Le Pen. And the radical right gender gap, he managed to recreate one, like at the time of the father, and not Marine Le Pen. Conclusion, if we want to stay in the 40 minutes, but maybe I wanted so much not to be too long that I've been too short. Explaining radical right populism, it's a long-term process. And it's a multi-dimensional process. To go back to the initial questions, cultural crisis, well, I would say that the vote for these two and for other radical rights in Europe is rooted in many economic crises, long before the economic crisis produced by the war in Ukraine. You must go back to the 2 oil shocks, ending economic growth in the mid-70s. That's where starts the appeal for these parties. 2, there has been the accelerated process of economic and financial globalization in the 90s. And then, of course, the 2008 recession, and last, the Ukraine war economic impact. And of course, there have been many and even many more identity crises. But there again, we must go back in the past. What was the root for all these movements, at least in France and the countries that have had colonies? It's decolonization, the refusal to lose the French Empire. That's how Le Pen started in politics. Then it's the opposition to European integration, the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, the Constitutional Treaty of 2005, with the idea that it's a dreadful, deadly threat, European integration, for French culture and French identity, for the French nation. 3, there was Islamic terrorism, and France was especially hit, especially in 2012, but especially in 2015, and more recently, the assassination of the teacher Samuel Paty. And last, there was also the refugees crisis, which was also felt as a danger, a wave, likely, like these parties say, to overwhelm the real nationals. So cultural and economic insecurity matter. And that brings us to nuance quite a lot, the cultural backlash theory. There's a very good, I put a list of reference at the end of my presentation. Armin Scheffer wrote a very good book where he really deconstructs completely the theory of Norris and Engelhardt, and I'm very much in line with what he says. My data completely confirms what he does on the basis of European data. So you definitely, if you are interested in that cultural backlash theory, you must definitely read Armin Scheffer. So yes, support for the radical rights goes indeed with an intolerant, anti-immigrant, anti-Islam ideology in defense of the nation, its cultural identity, its way of life, its food, its tradition, its native people. The first book of Le Pen is called French First. And all over Europe, it's the same cry. Austria first, Germany first, Italy first. And there's a nostalgia for a golden age of imagined grandeur, like in the States, MAGA, Make America Great Again. It's the same idea. So there is something there absolutely exact in the cultural backlash theory, but it's not so verified, validated, as far as moral conservatism is concerned. On the issues of sexuality, gender, family, religion, it's not necessarily the case. It can be in Italy, it can be in the post-communist democracies, in Hungary, for instance, but Marine Le Pen, it's not at all the case. She didn't take part, for instance, in the large anti-gay marriage marches that we had at the time of François Hollande in 2013 and after. She claims she defends women's rights. She says she defends the rights of women, gay, Jews, against Islamic fundamentalism. She is not, as we say here, catho-tradi, a traditional Catholic. She is vehemently secular. So it's not exactly the profile expected. Zemmour fits the image much better. He is ultra-conservative, sexist, virilist, masculinist, whatever you want. And he really is a cultural backlash candidate, but he failed electorally. There again, you have a very interesting paper in French, but it's going to be translated in English by Gilles Ivaldi in the last issue of the Revue Française de Sciences Politiques, French Political Science Review, where he shows the advantage and limitations of a cultural backlash theory with more indicators. They have an online survey which he uses over time. Now, there are 2 points I'd like to make also. When one looks at values by cohorts, by birth cohorts, you see that all the society, even the older generations, are more culturally liberal as time goes by. They're just less tolerant than the young. So it's not so much an opposition, a counter-reaction, which would put them completely, fully against these trends, especially the moral trends. It's a question of degree. And I'll show it on the barometer of racism that I do for the National Commission for the Defense of Human Rights since 1990, exploring all the forms of racism. Well, last and before I show you the barometer data, those who vote for these parties, they are the young people, not the elderly. And one must never mistake attitudes and votes. In our barometer for the National Commission for Human Rights, we look at the attitudes and their evolution through times, and all the data we have show us that actually, paradoxically, people in France and in Europe are more tolerant on the whole as time goes by of immigration, more accepting Islam, especially the young, but even the elderly. The trends go in the same direction, but they go much slower among the elderly. It's the same for the gays, accepting people who think that homosexuality is a way like another to live your sexual life. In the 90s, there were 54%. Today, there are 90%. That doesn't leave many people who reject the right of gays to live as they want. And if you look at the idea of women have the right to abort, there were 48% in France in 1974. The last survey I saw, there were almost 80%. So there again, society as large is moving towards more cultural liberalism. But a minority, and these parties, especially in France, still attract a minority of voters. There's a minority that goes against. And one must not also mistake these attitudes with the vote, because at the moment where you vote, first you must be French. Our surveys they include the foreigners and the children of foreigners. 2, you must be registered. And when you are immigrant born, it takes time to integrate politically and to register. You need to be registered on the electoral list to vote. So if you are French, if you are registered, if you do not abstain, and the proportion of people who don't turn out is growing, then you have votes, and votes take place in a specific context of an election. And the cultural issues were not at all at the heart of that presidential election of 2022. It's purchase power that was at the heart, social and economic issues. So even if these evolutions are remarkable, the evolutions towards more cultural liberalism, that's not necessarily what counts. Even feminism and anti-feminism was not at all at the heart of the votes, even after the Me Too movements. So I'll finish on that. It's a beautiful graph that has been done by my colleague, Vincent Tiberi, who works with me every year for the survey on racism. And it shows you the evolution of what he calls the Indice longitudinal de tolérance, longitudinal tolerance index. He uses some 72 series of questions of our Racism Barometer that have been asked at least 3 times. And then he sees that it's an indicator of tolerance that varies between 0, if you never gave a tolerant answer, and 100, if you always gave it. And you see that by generation, up top, you see the younger generations in blue, down in purple, you see the elderly generations, and very, very low in blue, those who are either practically dead by now, there are practically none enough left in our survey. But if you look at the way generations score on our index of tolerance, you see that it all goes in the same directions. You do not have a complete counter reactions, even of the elderly. You see that the acceptance of the other is very slow and has stopped more or less among the elderly, those who were born between 1940 and 1955, but it's still going up among the young. And the general image you get is that cultural liberalism is slowly, with ups and downs, acceptance of the other, acceptance of different forms of sexuality, all that is going upwards. But votes don't necessarily follow the same trend. And the votes for these populist radical rights, not only le Front National, enfin, le Rassemblement National, not only Marine Le Pen and Zemmour, but all over Europe, they have different positions on moral issues, but what they really have in common is the rejection of immigration and Islam. And there they all side together, and there they resist. They don't, but alone, they resist that trend of liberalization. But alone, they don't change it. That's a big nuance to the theories of Engelhardt and Norris. And last, one must remember that nothing in politics is inevitable, that in the first round of an election, Marine Le Pen gets less than a quarter of the votes. It's only because in the second round, many people voted for her because they were voting against Emmanuel Macron, that she went up to 40% of the votes. And even in Italy, Giorgia Meloni, she got a quarter, her party got a quarter of the votes. In the Western European democracies, when these parties arrive in office, it's because they have had the help of the mainstream parties, because there has been an alliance. So just to tell you that the picture is a little more complicated than in the very interesting book of Engelhardt and Norris. And I think I shall stop there, but just I put here a couple of references that can be useful for anyone who wants to go on working on these problems of populism and cultural populism. There's the article of Ivaldi and Schaeffer, which are very useful because they directly attack the backlash, cultural backlash theory. With Anja Duhovic, we have been working on the recomposition of gender gaps and the impact of sexism on votes. And there's the old analysis by Piero Ignazzi. He was long before Inglehart and Norris speaking of a silent counter-revolution in attitude towards immigrants, towards gays, towards women's rights. And I think I shall stop there, so we have time to discuss. So now I shall stop the sharing. And it worked. So that's it. Maybe I went too fast.
No, you were brilliant, and you were not fast at all. On the contrary, if you agree, Soumaye, I will make a short summary and then launch the debate. Thank you once again. There have been so many insightful comments, and indeed, what you showed in the end somehow make us think that the thesis developed by Inglehart and Pippa-Norris goes quite well in the American system. In a bi-party political system, it's a little bit more complicated in our political systems with multi-parties and cross-cutting cleavages. I mean, the sorting they are putting, also political sorting they lay emphasis on, works a little bit more different. I also think that you showed what Rittgen and Alzheimer in the book you published also in 2018, how difficult it is to identify determinants of the radical right populists, because they are context dependent. So it's very difficult to identify single determinants, and in the meantime it's very complicated because there is a constellation of radical right populism. It's not only one formula. And what I was surprised, and I was thinking about the literature that for example Piero Stighi, he wrote extensively on populists from below, the low part of politics, while in the case of Zemmour is something different. And so I wonder if we call them radical right populists, but there are two different types of radical right populism, and somehow I'm not an expert on French politics, I apologize, but I mean in the case of Zemmour, there are, however, he looks like an intellectual that he's not there to defend the people, he's there to defend the French grandeur, which is somehow different with what populism is about. And I would say that somehow he echoes elements that Pasquale de Villiers also somehow put in the political arena, although not with the same success. So I would like to hear how populist Zemmour is when he is so intellectual. So I mean, he speaks a different way of. He uses a different language if compared with Marine Le Pen. He looks like a French academician, not like a politician. Sometimes in the way he at least in the short it was not too short, the movie that he launched his campaign, it was rather interesting. And I wanted also to ask you if somehow Marine Le Pen and Wilders are not the exception in the galaxy of European populism in terms of this form of nationalization of gender and homosexuality, because if we look at the bigger European picture, most of the European forms are, or at least there is a huge percentage, they are highly traditionalist, they resemble more Zemmour than Marine Le Pen. And so this was also an element that I would like you to question, to raise a question. And last but not least, you did not talk about this, but somehow it is present as a background kind of information. You spoke about this antagonism in politics, which becomes a higher us against them, us the French natives against the immigrants and so on. Aren't we seeing somehow what the American political science has called a form of affective polarization, increasingly becoming rooted in the French politics? And from this point of view, we have a burgeoning literature that says that radical right populist parties, they are not only generator of affective populism, but they also attract this form of populism. So there is somehow a vicious circle, because the anti-populist camp somehow fed the rhetoric, feeds the rhetoric. Thank you. I mean, it was really brilliant. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your brilliant questions, because that's already, I'll take quite a long time to answer them all. First, I absolutely agree with the idea that we shouldn't compare the States with Europe. It's different worlds, and it's true that the number of parties and the traditions are not the same. So that's one of the flaws of Engelhardt and Norris. I'm absolutely, the determinants are indeed context dependent, and you really need to do work on each country separately, although there are some lines in common. Two, you consider Zemmour as an intellectual. Yes, compared to Marine Le Pen, he has read far more. She's not an idiot. She's a lawyer. She has done studies, but she's even not as intellectual as her father. Her father had read all the theoreticians of the far right, and the people who don't like Marine Le Pen in her own party call her the nightclubber and say the only things she is capable to read are cartoons. So there's quite a despise with the idea, while Zemmour is different. He is more bourgeois, and he attracts a more bourgeois clientele too. But I would say that doesn't prevent him from being a populist. He is populist in his style. If you look at him, he has a relaxed way of talking, using slang words, something that's very fashionable today among many political elites. But there he definitely is attarded with the traditional conservative way of talking politics. And he adores the clash, the scandal. He comes out with abominable things, and he loves that. And also, if you look not only at the style, but at the way he talks, he pretends to be a populist because he is anti-elite, because he says he's the one who represents the real people in France. So it's not the same populism than a Marine Le Pen. They don't have the same physical appearance. They don't have the same way to dress. They don't have the same way to talk. One is definitely more intellectual and probably more bourgeois, some people say, around some in. Just to give you an example, if you take the map of Paris in the last elections and you look in which quartier, there are 80 quartiers in Paris, where did Zemmour get his best scores? In the 16th, in the 8th, 17th, in the bourgeois gentrified part of Paris, the map is beautiful. Zemmour on the gentrified side, Jean-Luc Mélenchon on the old working class side, Marine Le Pen quasi nothing because she does her best scores in rural and small town areas. Now, but there's something there about the class difference between Marine Le Pen and Zemmour, but he still has and pretends to be a populist. But you're right, it's not the same style. Now, the other thing you were saying, yes, exception, is Marine Le Pen an exception in Europe? I should have added to the references a very interesting paper by Donovan, who does a study to see where there still is a radical right gender gap. First, there never was always a radical right gender gap. It depends on the countries, and it depends on the type of election. So it's a complicated, and he shows, and he has a theory, he says that the gender gap is greater, it resists in northern countries which are more gender-friendly, because their men feel more threatened by, it's not so much the women, but the men. Men feel more threatened by feminism. And it's amusing because paradoxically, these countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they often had women leaders, and they often had women-friendly, quasi-feminist positions because their countries are so much more feminist than the Latin countries, to say it quickly. And that paradox he explains like that. So it's really interesting to read his analysis, because I was trying to wonder why. So I don't think Marine Le Pen is the exception, but she is the most flagrant case of disappearance of the radical right gender gap. And it's really interesting because it resists to all the controls. And we started working on that long ago, the European elections of 1984, and gender already was, the differences were fading, but now there's really something there. So people like Francesca Scrinzi or Elisabelle, many Italians working on comparing the two are also helpful there to show us that there's a difference, but even Giorgia Meloni is gaining votes among women, but less than Marine Le Pen. And she presents herself as a mother, a Catholic, while Marine Le Pen presents herself as a mother, but a quasi-feminist. Now, the us-them dimension, that's very important. Emotions matter in politics. There's quite a literature now about effective polarization, and it's true. And it makes me think of the work of a psychologist I've worked with often, whose name is George Marcus, and he worked a lot on the impact of emotions, but what emotions? And we often say that it's fear that puts the voters in the arms of these parties. Well, it's more complicated. He shows that fears actually makes people think twice before they vote. It cuts their routine habit. They may vote for parties they would never have imagined voting for. But what really makes the trick for voting for these parties and for voting for Marine Le Pen, it's anger. And I think it's the same in the US, because he compared. So there's definitely a very important dimension of emotions to explain. But after all, emotions are important for all choices in politics, but maybe even more for these populist candidates who make a permanent show. There's something there. And there was a very good paper also about Marine Le Pen, the way she imposed herself. She was at the time a mother and daughter, woman and man. So there's a lot to do about gender and emotions, how all that to go further. I did something very dry with just electoral data, but you're absolutely right. You must go further for that. And there's one thing I hadn't discussed. I was telling you that Zemmour made his best scores in the 16th, the 17th, and the 8th, but he also made good scores, not 7, but 18%, in parts of Paris in the 19th, and in the suburbs in Sarcelles, where there is an important Jewish community afraid, very afraid, because the number of aggressions against Jews has been rising since the Second Intifada. Many people have tried to go to Israel, very often came back because it's not so simple. But you see that there's even, it counts for nothing in the votes, but there is a proportion, a sizable proportion of votes in some sections for somebody like Zemmour, because yeah, of course, he's said awful things, but maybe he can defend us against Islamic fundamentalism and against immigrant and against Islam. There's a turn to the right of a part of the Jewish minority in France. And you see it with aggregate data in the 19th, when you look at the voting stations, and in the Sarcelles, because I've been working a lot in Sarcelles, which is the next red suburb of Paris, where you have a large community of Jews and Muslims and people, immigrants from all over the world. And you see that there's that Zemmour vote, even though in fact the relations are much better than we imagine, but that's another subject, relations between minorities. But thank you for your questions.